Right. Hey everyone, I'm Klloo. So, let's talk about Majestics a bit more. Now, generally speaking, I think we can start to widely accept that they are definitely becoming the main barrier of entry for Flesh and Blood when it comes to new players or even transitioning from one class to another, right? You might think equipment or legendaries, but generally speaking, all of the sets post 2.0 that now have the Rainbow Fall and Cold Falls included in the same product generally have a much more reasonable point of entry, price of entry, right, than some Majestics. So, I do sincerely think that going forward, the big hiccup in the game will circulate around Majestics, which brings us to our nice table, which I've blown up, thinned down a little, and hopefully made easier to follow along with our nice mouse pointer. So, I have currently all of the main sets of Flesh and Blood, Welcome to Rathe, through to the Hunted, along with the data that we do know currently about High Seas. Now, if you want the majority of the data, so the supplemental sets included, I'll put that in the description. If you want to peruse that or scrutinize it, go nuts. But other than that, in terms of this table, we can really jump into some of the issues going on with Majestics, as well as sort of the factor behind it, right? And it's sort of to do with the pricing of Flesh and Blood, if we rationalize it. So a 25% increase in terms of its MSRP. So Welcome to Rathe through to the Hunted. That is a long time span of a lot of significant worldly events that would probably make you think that this number would, for especially a smaller company, when we compare it to a major TCG like LSS, would generally have been higher, right? A 25% increase over the lifespan of Flesh and Blood is just awesome on behalf of LSS, right? But they have definitely made up for it by other means. So, if we start to look at set total. So this is the set size. So Welcome to Rathe, 226, towards Hunted, 262, right? So that's already a 16% increase, which is, nothing to sneeze at, because a 16% increase still means, generally speaking, right, if we try to rationalize it, a 16% increase in the amount of product that needs to be opened, right? Meaning that that 25% increase in price is actually equivalent to a little bit higher, because generally speaking, we as a community have to open more products to find everything that we want. When this comes to Majestics, the numbers start to get a bit higher. So, Welcome to Rathe and Arcane Rising both had 10 Majestics along with 15 super rare cards. Now, for the sake of comparison, super rares are just being counted as Majestics, so think of it as 25 in relation to, say, Hunted's 42. Right? This marks a 68% increase in Majestics, right? So set size has gone up and total number of Majestics has gone up. Again, meaning that the amount of product we as a community need to open to supply the secondary market to find all our playsets has gone up, right? Meaning that that price point increase is now compounded in a sense. So we can then break it down further, right? We didn't have the expend slot from Welcome to Rathe to Outsiders, came in Bright Lights, Heavy Hitters, missed Rosetta, Hunted, and eventually through High Seas. Now, just to point out for High Seas, right, why I'm not doing the comparison is although we know the set total and we know the Majestic count, when it comes to the expand slot, we don't know quite yet how many Majestics it will be. We know the total number of expand slot cards, but generally speaking, we don't know if it will have a legendary reprint. We expect that. We don't know if it'll have legendary equipment. Don't really expect that. I think LSS is steering away from that, but it could still happen, so I don't want to include the data. All the other data is strictly what I've pulled off of the Flesh and Blood website, right? So directly published by LSS, except for anything in yellow. This we've had to sort of not guess, but substitute, and we'll go over it once we get down to that portion. But when it comes to the expand slot, so again, for the Hunted, we have 27 limited Majestics, which is to say that these are the Majestics that are in set, valid for the heroes in the set, and not in the expansion slot, whereas we have 15 expansion slot Majestics, right? Now, the 27 means it's only a 8% increase over the 25 Majestics within Welcome to Rathe or Arcane Rising. So not a big increase, right? It's when we get to the expansion slot Majestics that it becomes really rough, because LSS, by and large, like to maintain their whole 1 in 4 pull rate for Majestics, but that doesn't necessarily mean that, in terms of expand slot and limited Majestics, that they have remained at 1 in 4. So, percentage-wise, right, in terms of how much of the set is occupied by Majestics. Well, again, Welcome to Rathe, Arcane Rising, 11.42%, right? Now up to 16% in the Hunted. So while technically speaking, the limited Majestic, the ratio of it in comparison to the total size of the set, has decreased, the overall amount of Majestics occupy a larger amount of a bigger set size, right? All of these compounding factors means that more product needs to be open in order to supply the market, right? Basically overruling a minor price point increase, right? It's relatively a lot bigger than a 25% increase. So when it comes to pull rates, again, we have our 1 in 4 for our Majestics, with the exception of Outsiders, which was 1 in 5, but it is now broken up differently. So if we look at the pull rates of any of the prior to 2.0 sets, right, it's listed as 1.75 per pack. Now that number has changed in our newer sets to being our 1.83, meaning that the percentage, right, of chance to pull a Majestic has decreased. Our limited Majestics sit at 17%, right, decreased from that 25%, so a negative 32% to the pull rate, right, which again means that more product has to be opened. Now, we can reverse engineer our expend slot. Although it's been stated as 1 in 15, it is actually more equivalent to 1 in 12.5 packs, just as our Majestics aren't actually 1 in 4 packs, but rather 1 in 5.9 packs, right? So again, everything has been increased across the board, meaning that overall, more product has to be opened to find the Majestics. So what we can do with all of these numbers is then create a comparison in terms of how much product needs to be opened. So when we refer to this, our product per Majestic total, what I mean by that is basically we as a community, how much product do we have to open so that everyone can get a supply of Majestics, right? So I've used just one copy of each Majestic. So basically, how much Welcome to Rathe needs to be opened to find 25 of the rarity cards, right? For Hunted, how much product needs to be opened to find 42, right? So pack-wise, that's 82 packs roughly for Welcome to Rathe, jumping up to 137 packs for the Hunted. Now, if we factor in the pull rates for the expand slot, because they are on separate rolls, essentially, right? Separate loot tables, however you want to refer to it, it means that to get all of our limited Majestics, as well as our expansion Majestics, to see at least one copy of all of them, then our amount of packs to open jumps up to 157, right? So that is quite the increase from that 82 of Welcome to Rathe. In terms of cases, right? Less than a case in Welcome to Rathe. So basically, every case, if you open them all up, you even out all the cards, will supply one set of all the super rares and Majestics for the community. For the Hunted, it would now take 1.43 cases to do just that. So if you factor in a larger community size, a slight increase to the product pricing, that's a substantial jump, right? Again, by and large, the community now has to open a larger amount of product in order to supply the same amount of copies of Majestics as those earlier sets. So then to put it in a value perspective, it would take $326 worth of Welcome to Rathe, again, if we take out the randomness, right, and act as a community, to supply one copy of all Majestics and super rares to the secondary market, right? Equivalently, for the Hunted, that number, thanks to the slight increase, the increase in set size, the increase in Majestics, the decrease in pull rates, jumps up to $787. That is more than double the cost of Welcome to Rathe, right? So as a base perspective for our Majestics, the price has increased substantially. Now we have offsets, right, by way of, again, the number of Majestics. So in the sense of Welcome to Rathe, that $326 gets divided by our 25 and gives us a base amount, right, an average amount for a Majestic at $13.06 versus that of the Hunted having only increased to $18.75, meaning that while, again, the amount of product that has to be open to find everything has jumped up quite a lot, right, the actual value of said Majestic should be a little bit more reined in. Now, we also have the other main offsets, which are our high chase rarity pieces. So again, Welcome to Rathe, we had Legendaries, Fables, and Cold Foils in the first edition boxes, versus what we see nowadays of Cold Foils, Legendaries, Marvels, our Fable, Extended Arts, and sometimes even our Alternative Arts, right? So all of those factors should still help rein in the pricing of our Majestics. But by and large, what we also see is that we as a community prefer to play the game than to collect the game. I'm not saying that Flesh and Blood is not collectible, and they're not actually pieces of substantial monetary value. It's just that, generally speaking, there are a lot more people who just want the cards to play with than there are who actually want to collect, right? So, the offsets don't necessarily work the way they should. But the biggest factor of this to really take away, especially when we look at the upcoming set of high seas, is the fact that, again, by and large, these increases mean that any increase to, say, the print size is not as relevant as you might think, right? Remember, Welcome to Rathe was sitting at plus 200,000, right? It's taken a while, but we're most likely back to those numbers with the Hunted and High Seas being more than that. So even if it's at 250,000, that increase from 200,000 to 250,000 is not as relevant because of all these other factors that have increased the amount of product that needs to be opened to, again, find those playsets of Majestics, the playsets of the game pieces that we really want to utilize. So then to put that in a little bit of perspective, right, in relation to Majestics, if we use that 68% more product needs to be opened to supply Majestics, that means a 300,000 display print run, right, which is what we could possibly expect from High Seas, would actually be equivalent to a 178,000 print run, right? That is the big worry, especially when we look then at the current prices of Majestics per class. Well, no surprise, right? Generics sit as the most expensive Majestic cards in the game, right? So basically, what we're looking at here is if you wanted a playset of all current Majestics in its respective classing, right? So generic, assassin, ranger, mechanologist, or an earth, or lightning, or draconic, right? How much would it cost? Now, for the sake of the talents, they are not the, say, earth wizard cards. They are strictly the earth cards, strictly the lightning cards, with any earth wizard cards then being placed in wizard, and vice versa for all the other talented classes. So, yeah, generic sits at a whopping $2,062 US if you wanted to buy a complete playset of every generic in the game Majestic at this current point, right? That is quite the hefty number, especially when, again, you factor in the fact that, you know, Shelter from the Storm, Command and Conquer, and Lion Strike, Warmongers, Diplomacy, these cards make up the bulk of that value. Next, the classes. So, Assassin, no surprise, coming in as the second expensive, $854 if you want to pick up every Majestic Assassin currently has. The worry there is basically, this is a perspective into the future of Necromancer, right? If LSS doesn't make drastic changes to how they handled Assassin, this is potentially what we're looking at, right? Necromancer becoming one of the most expensive classes of the game. Up next, we do have a Ranger at $773, Mechanologist as $684, and then Warrior and Runeblade around $400, with the rest of the classes dropping down to around $200, $250, right? Now, worth noting when it comes to, say, Wizard or Runeblade currently, or even Guardian, right? Earth makes up a big bulk of that, so throw in that extra $411 for your Fallings and everything else that racks up a pretty penny, right? But it still doesn't quite outcompete Assassin. It gets close to Ranger, but generally speaking, these two classes are kind of a sore point for the game right now, and it's no surprise if we then take a look at the expensive cards within each of these sectors. Codex of Frailty is our number one, right? So Codex of Frailty currently is at $108, followed by Shelter from the Storm at $104, then Felling of the Crown at $53. So that is quite the jump. Now, Codex fits into two classes, whereas Shelter from the Storm fits into a lot more. Now, whether or not Shelter from the Storm is a mandatory game piece, right, for certain classes is questionable, whereas Codex of Frailty you will find in basically every list of Assassin and Ranger, probably till the end of time, just because of what it does functionally. It's basically the same case as Command and Conquer, prior to us getting a whole bunch of other arsenal disrupting cards to try and ease Command and Conquer. Now the question is, do they print something like Codex of Frailty, or do they reprint Codex of Frailty, or do they just hope that it comes down as certain heroes cycle out? It's a very, very solid question that I guess we'll find an answer to once we see High Seas. But still, right, these outliers, if you will, of generics, of Assassin, of kind of Ranger, right, are what are a bit turbulent when it comes to Majestics for Flesh and Blood. And a lot of us already are expecting / know that the printing for High Seas is not going to do it, right? It's not going to quite be enough for what we've seen in terms of community growth, which is, again, completely understandable. You got to remember, LSS is, you know, however many sets, 2 to 3, right, behind, so to speak. So the numbers for High Seas were locked in before LSS could really do anything about the most recent growth of the game. But that doesn't mean we don't need to see changes going forward. For instance, generics, one of the big issues that I have is LSS knows first and foremost that it is applicable to every other class in the game. So if anything, generics should be printed at a higher rate than any other game piece in the game. The other obvious one is when it comes to Assassin or Necromancer, how exactly they're going to handle that going forward. Again, we expect the Armory deck to line the load, but we also know that the Armory deck is a one-and-done print run, just like every other Armory deck, and generally speaking, they also haven't coped too well with the community size of Flesh and Blood at the moment. So throw in the fact that Necromancer is probably going to be a really popular class to get into, similar again to Assassin Ranger, which for noting, right, if we take a look at the Living Legend table, aren't really the top of the current standing, right? They're not the most played classes of the season. You have New doing exceptionally well, but then the others are definitely, sort of middle ground to low in terms of what is actually seeing play, yet Codex still remains a very elusive card. Again, we did notice that Outsiders did have a lower pull rate for Majestics, but then going back to the table, right, pull rates by and large are this double-edged sword. LSS, on the one hand, are helping to maintain the value of Majestics, right? Imagine that they increase the pull rate of Majestics as they increase the number of Majestics. Then, all in all, they would be devalued, right? So it's whether or not we accept and / agree with the current price point of Majestics and the big sort of gaps between what is good / playable and what is exceedingly exceptional, right? All this value, again, looking at that number for Hunted of $18.75 per Majestic, that's obviously not true. We don't have every Majestic at $18.75. We have some Majestics that are a couple dollars, and then we have Shelter from the Storm jumping up, siphoning that value, and being a $100 card. So it's whether or not you sort of agree with this perspective from LSS, and it's just a case of really drastically increasing the print size to, again, factor for these changes, or if something does have to be done about the pull rates, and overall they need to be reined in a bit more and kept in check. So if we do get those outlying Majestics, those really sought-after Majestics, then their prices won't skyrocket like what we've seen with the case of, again, Shelter, Command & Conquer, and Lion Strike, Warmonger's Diplomacy, Truce for a little bit as well, right? All these easily $30, $40 plus Majestics. So yeah, it's definitely a matter of opinion and perspective what you would like to see the game, the direction go in. Overall, I would definitely like to see that ceiling reined in and brought down quite a bit, to be honest. I think a playset of Majestics being, $60 to $80 would be happy, right? That's where I'm at happily. But yeah, still, in all honesty, LSS have just done the best that they could possibly do, again, with the main prerogative since day one being to keep the game collectible, right? Rewarding people for holding on to pieces, pulling pieces. So maintaining that in the sense of what they've done with pull rates is okay. It's doing its job slightly, right? But again, the major worry for High Seas is the fact that it will be the funnel for Necromancer, right? So going back to, again, the average price of a Majestic, well, when it comes to High Seas, we know that a lot more of the Majestics will definitely be necessary, right? You have all the Pirate X-Class cards, you have all the Necromancer cards, where those Majestics, you won't have a split between what slots into an already existing deck and what gets sidelined. We would have a more of a majority be cards that actually are played, and therefore, again, maintain that high value, right? If every Majestic sits at $18, that is still just as bad as one being $100. So, yeah, all in all, I am very curious to see where LSS goes with it, right? We won't notice significant changes till probably the sets of next year, if that, right? But overall, FAB continues to grow, right? Which is definitely a great outlook for the game. But prices may be just a tad bit concerning, right, for new players. And again, swapping classes. Anyway, what would you like to see, right? What are your hopes for the future? Hope you enjoyed. See ya.